Yeah, so thank you very much for coming out on this dark and very cold evening. I really appreciate it. It's great to see so much interest. I suspect that you've heard quite a lot about COP30 in Belém on the radio and TV media over the past couple of weeks. And I guess what I want to do today is to try and maybe dig a little deeper into what happened, give you our impressions, then we can answer some questions and talk together a little bit afterwards. Okay, so there's quite a lot of jargon in the international climate arena. Even Michael and I can get a bit confused sometimes, so let me make sure that we're all on the same page. So what is the COP? It's not a police officer, you'll have worked that out. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. And again, parties are not festive events. Parties refer to countries. The parties are the 197 countries that have signed up to the UN climate change treaties. Now, there's 3 of those, but the one you're most likely to be familiar with is the 2015, the Paris Agreement. And that introduced a number of concepts, obligations that I think are familiar to us now. For example, net zero. The idea that we have to bring emissions down so they balance out removals by forests. That's the concept of net zero. Also these temperature ceilings, 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, preferably 1.5. National emission pledges that all countries, as opposed to formally submit, they're called NDCs, more jargon. And also supplying finance to poorer countries. That's very important. This principle of fairness, of equity, does run through the climate treaties. So basically, the COP's job in principle is very easy, quite simply to implement those treaties, to review how they're going and take further decisions if needed. I've given some examples of specifics here. Developing work programmes, technical guidelines, and as I said, financial technology support. There's usually about 40 or so agenda items at every COP, going from deeply technical stuff to the kinds of issues that you guys might be interested in, about equity, about helping developing countries, about sharing the burden, that kind of thing. So the COP meets annually. In different locations, and as it so happens, this year there were multiple anniversaries. So COP30, you'll have guessed 30 years since the first COP, COP1 in Berlin. It is 35 years, so there is a 35th anniversary from the start of the very climate negotiations, which was actually in 1990. And it's also 10 years since the Paris Agreement was adopted. So there was this real kind of serendipity in timing, the sense that this was really an opportunity to take stock of progress and look to the future. So not only that, but there was a lot of symbolism in the particular location in Brazil, because those of you my age and older might remember the UN Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio. That was very much seen as the start of the global environmental movement. And as I say, Brazil hosted that in Rio. It was also where the first UN climate treaty was signed. And then Belém. So Belém, I mean, I didn't even know where it was, but it was very much at the mouth of the Amazon. It's called the Gateway of the Amazon. And I think for everyone, the Amazon rainforest has this kind of real resonance as kind of being emblematic of the global environment, the lungs of the world, if you will. So there was a lot of symbolism here that everyone was very much aware of. And the thing is, we very much needed a good COP this year. Why is that? Okay, so I think this is the only chart I'm going to show you, but it's basically there to show you that much more progress is needed. And you can read this in different ways. You can see the global fossil CO2 emissions. So CO2 emissions from coal, oil and gas accounts for about 80% of global warming. So this year, again, it reached a record high. But the actual rate of increase over the past decade has been slowing down to 0.8% versus 2.1% the year before. And there's signs that possibly that emissions curve may have peaked. We may be on our way down. However, Equally, as you can see on this thermometer, we've already reached 1.3 degrees of warming, above pre-industrial levels, I should say. That was in 2023. It was just past 1.5, that key goal. In 2024, it's gone down a bit to 1.4 this year so far, but we're hovering around that 1.5 threshold. And these show you where we might get by 2100. So at the moment, with everything declared, we're looking at a probable 2.6 degree world by 2100. So that's a lot higher than even the 2 degree target of the Paris Agreement. If absolutely everything everyone says they're going to do is implemented, there's an optimistic scenario of 1.9, which would obviously be a lot better. So basically the aim of COP was to try and kind of move us closer to the optimistic scenario. Unfortunately, there were very strong headwinds against that. I probably don't need to tell you very much about the current geopolitical and economic context that we're living in. Some of my colleagues call it a polycrisis. You know, everything seems to be going wrong everywhere all at once. And certainly this makes it much more difficult, especially for democracies, to really take serious policies on climate change for all these reasons I don't need to go into. And of course, you know, the main disruptor of all of this, certainly for people who care about climate change, is the current incumbent in the White House. Certainly prospects for climate action saw a sharp downturn with the second Trump administration. I think nobody ever thought that Trump would be a major supporter of, you know, rapid decarbonisation, but I think we were all taken a bit aback by the vitriolic climate denialism, which is actually very rare nowadays to actually deny the reality of climate change. But I've just listed here a few of his quotes taken from a very formal ceremonial UN General Assembly address in September. So you can just kind of see the stuff that the world is up against. It's not just words. If it was just words, it really wouldn't matter. But on Trump's first day in office, he withdrew from the Paris Agreement, which, to be fair, he did last time as well. But then recently, we've had further evidence of how much impact, proper concrete impact, this can have, and beyond the US. Yeah, obviously Trump is dismantling everything resembling a climate policy in the US, but it's also happening internationally. So I'm not sure if you're following the negotiations on shipping emissions in the International Maritime Organization. There was a deal already to go through, which would have introduced really milestone emission obligations, mandatory emission obligations on ships to reduce their carbon footprint. This is really strong stuff. And basically pressure from the US in terms of threats of trade tariffs on supportive countries and even threats of visa restrictions on individual negotiators. So this meant that this was basically, thrown out the water, I was going to say, but no pun intended. But this was a serious sign of just what the Trump administration could do. And actually, there have been estimates by some of my colleagues that say that Trump being there for the second administration will raise global temperatures by 0.1 degree, which is quite a lot. And all this obviously is happening in the midst of escalating weather extremes. These are just, 3 examples. You could cite many. Hurricane Melissa, just before COP30 in Jamaica. This particular typhoon in the Philippines, even more recently. And, it's not just developing countries, right? It's everybody who's at risk. This is from the Los Angeles, California wildfires. Okay, so for COP30, it was up to Brazil to try and sort all this out as much as possible. So the great thing about Brazil is that the president, Lula, he was backing this all the way. So they really had his political weight behind him. But the man who was in charge of the negotiations on a day-to-day, out-of-hour basis was this chap here, Andrea Correa de Largo, who was a career diplomat. And this was a good team. Yes, the people had confidence that they could really try and harness the energy from their historical legacy and bring the countries to a meaningful consensus. And they were saying all the right things to try and inspire the delegates. They would defend multilateralism, which of course everyone would agree with. It would be the COP of truth. It would seek to combat disinformation. It would boost implementation. So this is basically moving us closer to that optimistic scenario that you saw. It would be people-centred, so very much focused on equity, on marginalised groups, on human rights. And they invented this kind of a forum called the Mutirao, which basically means a collective effort drawing on indigenous people's tradition. I mean, it's basically a meeting, but calling it a mutirao made it seem much more rousing. And then there was this tantalising prospect when Lula suggested that Brazil would champion developing roadmaps on phasing out fossil fuels, so coal, oil and gas, and also on zero deforestation. Now, deforestation was not a surprise. Brazil was always going to push on forests. But you may or may not know that the climate regime has had quite a blind spot about fossil fuels, which is a bit strange, you might say, seeing as they account for 80% of global warming. But it was only 2 years ago in Dubai that the COP managed to agree in its conference declaration something about the need to transition away from fossil fuels. And the reason for that blind spot is not difficult. It's basically because of large oil exporting countries that want to delay progress. But it looked like the Brazilians were going to push on that. So that was, I must say, quite an exciting prospect. Okay, so let's turn to COP30 itself. So Belém welcomed some 50,000 people for those 2 weeks. Obviously not all at the same time, but on the peak day there were 18,000 people in that conference centre. I should say not just government delegates. Probably about half of that, or a third, were civil society representatives from everywhere, every possible organisation you can think of, churches, environmental NGOs, indigenous peoples, business groups, local authorities, everything you can think of. Now, welcoming 50,000 people was a major logistical challenge for Belém. There's no international airport, virtually no roads, people have to come by boat, that kind of thing. To the point, I thought this was quite funny, they had to bring in cruise ships to house some delegates on the Amazon. So anyway, Michael managed to find an Airbnb, but apparently it was quite a squeeze in Belém. So it began with the ceremonial opening, with all the dignitaries making their inspirational speeches. And you'll be proud, the UK was very well represented. We had Prince William, as you can see there, also second slide, as well as Keir Starmer, as well as Ed Miliband, who incidentally stayed the full 2 weeks, was very engaged and helped chair some very important negotiations on climate finance. So once all that ceremony was over and done with, there were 2 weeks of very lively, very heated, very intense talks and negotiations in large plenary halls, in small meeting rooms, in the corridors, in cafes. As I say, partly about very interesting political concepts, all the way down to deeply tedious minutiae and technicalities. And as the deadline approached, these talks began to spill well into the night. It's not unusual at all to have 3 overnight meetings right until the last moment. And it all ended with a very dramatic finale. You can see here with some countries protesting the decisions on the grounds that they were too weak, and others insisting that they couldn't be strengthened. It was, it was really quite exciting for people like me. It's like more fun than any kind of blockbuster movie, to be honest. But there was also drama from other sources. I'm not sure if you heard about this. Being in the Amazon, it kind of were, biblical rain every afternoon. But unfortunately, these also flooded the conference centre. And sometimes I'd be talking to colleagues. They say, I need to move because there's a leak from the ceiling. It's going onto my laptop. Yeah, and that's true. I'm not making that up. And then on the Thursday before the end, there was a fire. You couldn't make it up. there was literally an electrical fire that caught in the pavilion area where countries have their stands. I first heard about this when Michael told me he'd been evacuated. So that was actually quite dramatic. And I think for many people, it was really a kind of metaphor. You know, the Earth was trying to tell the COP something. And I just wanted to recall this very interesting soundbite that Greta Thunberg once said. I want you to act as if your house is on fire, because it is. And this time it really was. We had floods and fires in the same conference centre. Right. So what actually came out all of this? What was / was not agreed? So first of all, we always give the bad news, don't we? And I can't lie to you, it was a deeply, deeply disappointing COP. I think if this talk had been scheduled on Sunday, I'm not sure I could have done it because I wouldn't have wanted to depress everybody. I have teared up since, but so it proved impossible to do anything at all on fossil fuels, or even on the more positives, expanding renewable energy. There was nothing. The words energy, fossil fuels appear nowhere in the conference documents at all. And this was very, very disappointing. Personally, I think we've even gone backwards from what we agreed 2 years ago in Dubai. The same on zero deforestation, not quite so bad. There was weaker language, but certainly no roadmap. So that again was disappointing. As I said, finance is really a major part of the whole climate setup. You know, developing countries really do rely on financial support from the rich world for them to implement their decarbonisation strategies. And some new goals were agreed. I'll tell you about those in a minute, but there was very little actual cash pledge. You know, you hope that various countries, UK, Japan, they'll say, OK, fine, we'll give you $20 million or whatever. There were very few of those pledges. And I think, this has been happening the past couple of years. There was a failure to highlight key findings from the science from very authoritative sources. So, for example, the last 11 years have been the warmest on record. 2024 was the warmest ever. And yet countries just would not agree to actually just say this, to say, oh, the WMO report says this. Yeah, that there was no agreement on doing that. Some countries like India, Saudi Arabia said this was alarmist and it would mislead people. And I think for COP of Truth, many people found this really quite dispiriting. So I just want to tell you a little bit more about, why can't we talk about the main cause of global warming at a global warming COP? So just to be clear about this, it's because from the beginning, powerful oil exporters, and Saudi Arabia is the real standout here, they have sought to delay and detract from the very beginning, and just to avoid any kind of mention of energy, and especially oil, in any conference documents. That's the main reason. There is also this very strong resistance kind of anywhere really in the COP. Many countries feel this, to being told what to do. Yeah, they don't like the COP to say, right, you really should do this. You should have this goal. There's this real refrain that, national energy policies is decided in capitals and not in the intergovernmental arena. To be fair, I suspect that the UK would say this as well. But it's this kind of real adherence to sovereignty is definitely a break on intergovernmental cooperation. At this time in Berlin, vulnerable countries were very much focused on finance, on adapting to climate change, not really on fossil fuels. And they were annoyed at the lack of financial pledges. They weren't going to support fossil fuels. And then, this is the empty chair, the US absence weighed very heavily. So everyone's delighted there was no actual physical presence of the US delegation there. That was good. At least they weren't disrupting. However, where the US has been progressive and constructive, so under Obama, under Biden, they've been very good with their diplomatic influence at keeping other countries in line. Yeah, so increasing the ambition of China, cooperating with China, going together hand in hand with China, keeping the lid on the Saudis a bit. It's when the US is engaged that we've managed to make real strides forwards. And when they're not there, we can kind of see the impact. And there's really not been anybody there to take up the baton. In the end, Brazil just didn't have the political clout. They weren't able to carry it forwards. China, China tends to lead at home. It's a real green energy leader in China itself, but it hates to take a leading diplomatic position. That's just the kind of Chinese diplomatic psyche. I know Michael disagrees with me a little bit on this. And the EU likes to see itself as a leader, but it's too unwieldy, 27 countries plus the European Commission, too divided. You have Hungary, Poland, Italy that are really wanting to push back, too distracted, Ukraine, all the rest of it, too cash-strapped for reasons that we all know. But it wasn't all bad at all. So how can I put it? The lowest bar for me to not declare failure was that there should be the sense that climate multilateralism was hanging on. Yeah, and I think that we certainly got. So there was nobody else has left the Paris Agreement. There were rumours, oh gosh, Argentina might, what about Hungary? No, they all stood, they all participated. So the US is now an extremely good company with Iran, with Yemen and with Libya. They're the only 4 countries that are now outside the Paris Agreement. And then 122 countries tabled their updated climate pledges. You remember under Paris, you have to submit these regular climate pledges. So intent they're respecting what the Paris Agreement requires them to do. Even if the pledges are weak, at least they're respecting them. And in the conference declaration, a 10-page document, there were multiple reaffirmations of countries to multilateralism, to the Paris Agreement. There was this resolve to remain united. And just bear in mind that was adopted by consensus by 190 plus countries. That's no small thing. And I thought this was quite cute. All countries said they hope that the Paris Agreement will once again enjoy near universality, which is diplomatic speak for we really want the US to come back. And actually, all this was amplified the following day by a G20 declaration, so by the 20 most powerful countries in the world, minus US, 19 countries, that reaffirmed all of this and even more strongly. So that's a positive. And there were other outcomes. This gets a bit techie, but there were reasons why these delegates were celebrating Burkina Faso and Brazil. A goal to triple funds to help with adaptation by 2035, and a bunch of the other stuff that I'm not really going to go into, but this just transition mechanism to promote equitable, inclusive, participatory decarbonisation, really focused on labour rights, because obviously one of the arguments against climate change action is that, it will cut jobs. So they're trying to find a way of doing it so that it's fair to communities. Other work programs. And Brazil, outside the COP, it launched this Tropical Forests Forever Fund, and that was seen as being a really good move. It was outside the COP, so Brazil could just do that as it wanted. And I think there was a lot of disappointment that the UK, that Starmer did not pledge any money for that. I think there might be a bit of a turnaround in that, because he did come away with quite a lot of criticism for that. So there were some positives, but again, I can't sugarcoat it. These are all very incremental. They are not transformational. And if you remember from the 2 charts I showed, we don't just need this emissions curve to peak, we need it to go down. Yeah, and that is not going to make it go down, to be completely fair. It helps, but right. Something else that was really positive was the very active civil society engagement. So actually, the COP was held for the first time in a democracy for the past 4 years, and that made a big difference. So there was this massive climate change march, maybe 50, 60,000 people through the streets of Belém. Again, every group that you can think of. In fact, there was maybe a little bit too much engagement, because the indigenous peoples were determined to make their voices felt, which is absolutely right and proper. And they stormed the conference centre on one day, and then they blockaded it for 3 hours on the next day. But actually, they did get some gains. So Lula did announce more indigenous territories were going to be demarcated. So actually hosting the COP in a particular country can make a difference to policy within that country. And there's also Green Zone, which is specifically for civil society to showcase their achievements. I think, Michael, you were going to talk about about the green zone. So there are more positives, and that's why I had to go into smaller fonts, because there's so many other positives that we could mention. Again, I think Michael's going to talk about that. So I think we've got the sense now that progress on the ground, so in policies on the ground, especially in renewables, is definitely outpacing the kind of language that we see coming out of the COP. And there's lots of good news. China's the standout here. And I was reading Ethiopia has banned the import of fossil fuel cars. Colombia has a moratorium on oil and gas exploration. Philippines is on has decided to phase out coal. Vietnam has an emissions trading system. South Africa has a climate change act. So you can really see how it's almost like the global south is moving ahead, whereas us in the global north are kind of going around in circles a bit, in a bit of, quagmire at the moment. You kind of get the sense developing countries are moving ahead far more than they were. Certainly the US is not a monolithic country. Definitely US states. There were some US mayors in COP30 that were making it very clear they're going to go ahead with policies as far as they can. And there's a few countries that are just taking their initiatives outside the COP. So these Colombia, Netherlands and Brazil are trying to push the idea of the roadmap forwards in other ways. And something I think is really interesting, the International Court of Justice came out with a very landmark ruling in July. I'm not sure if we've got any lawyers here. Basically two things, elevating the obligation to tackle climate change. You don't have to be a party to the climate change treaties, so you still have an obligation under international law to tackle climate change. So that's kind of targeting the US. But also confirming that it is now possible to link particular weather events, to climate change and then back to emissions. It's not easy to do, but scientifically it can be done. And that opens up the way, to real possible more, there is a lot already, more litigation of companies, even of governments for not doing enough on climate change. So that could be a game changer. Okay, now my final slide. I just wanted to illustrate how the personal side, the human side of the negotiations. So this was in the final minutes of the plenary. So Russia had just accused the Latin American countries that were protesting at the weakness of the decisions. They were trying to change it. And that's not Russia, by the way. Russia had accused them of behaving like children. And then the Panamanian delegate from Panama, she, took up her microphone and she retorted, well, I would like to be like a child because children are extremely intelligent and visionary. We wish we all behaved like children to work for a better future. So just to show it, it's not just staid diplomats there. These people really do care about what they're doing, as I'm sure all of you do as well. Okay, well, that wasn't too bad, Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you very, very much for hosting us, for inviting us, and for everyone for coming. It's quite a turnout on a cold night, and I hope it's quite hard following Jo, right? I mean, that was a great overview. And I may say some things which slightly lighten the impression of some of it, but you can judge at the end. Let me start. What I actually like to do is give you a little bit of a flavour of the thing on the ground, and then move on a little bit to where does it leave us and where might we be going and why. First, I should clarify, I wasn't a delegate there. A delegate means a government negotiator in principle. I had been asked to go, particularly to present to a meeting inside the negotiating arena, but what's called a side event, where the idea is, experts come and present their research and the government delegates come and listen if you're lucky, because usually many of them are locked up in negotiations. But it is obviously an opportunity to gather. To clarify, a little while ago, I used to work quite extensively on the international negotiations and arena. After about 10 years, and we'd reached one major landmark agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, And I realised actually the big question was also becoming whether countries could implement their commitments. And I returned to look in more detail at sort of energy sector development. So I'm a bit of a techie geek as well as a bit of an international globetrotter on rare occasions, or not so rare occasions. So first of all, what was it like? There was an element of organised chaos. It was, shall we say, a bold and ambitious venture to host a conference with on the order of up to 20,000 people at one time and more than that overall in a city of 1.4 million people. That sounds like a big city, but actually the infrastructure was barely able to cope. And obviously, it was a very deliberate choice. It was a choice to locate it at the mouth of the Amazon. There are not only huge political fights within Brazil about the importance and future of the rainforest versus companies, some legal, many not, trying to do things in the Amazon for industrial, economic or other benefits. So it was a deliberately designed thing to put the Amazon at the center of the map domestically and internationally. Lula always being a big supporter of defending the Amazon. And let's remind us, amongst some of the more scary scientific scenarios is the possibilities that you start to get a feedback effect where you get drying in the Amazon, you start getting forest fires that become almost uncontrollable, and then you unwind the whole ecosystem of the Amazon, which would have global consequences. So, that was a political move, but it was interesting because also, while I'd become used to thinking of Brazil as a major emerging economy, has been the term for many years now. And if you go to Sao Paulo, probably you think, yep, that's a pretty major city, major economy. You go to Belém, you realize it's still a developing country. It's very much still a developing country. Difficult infrastructure, no real underground system. People have got rich enough to mostly have cars. They've tried to expand the roads, but some of the roads are broken, the sidewalks are broken, the traffic. People obey the traffic lights uniformly, so I guess there's good enforcement, but you can get massive queues. And trying to get to the COP could be quite a major adventure of navigation. And even the IT and communications sometimes failed. And that doesn't help the smoothness of operation. But it does underline, some of these countries may now be big and potentially global competitors, but they've got a lot of domestic issues they are also trying to struggle with. And the politics of saying, we in the developing world really need to step up to the plate and do more is still quite controversial in some of those countries. So it was quite important symbolically, domestically and internationally. And I think one thing that I'd add to Jo's remarks hinted at, but I think more explicitly, for 3 decades, one of the blocks on international processes has been the strong sense of international north-south division. And you can look at this 3 ways. You can look back and say, developed countries have predominantly caused this problem. They dominate historical emissions, and many developing countries would add, and yeah, they've done, in doing so, they have, that's how they've got rich, they've got technologically rich, and the rest of the world absolutely insists on the right to do the same. You can look at present and say, actually, the developed countries mostly have now significantly on the road of reducing emissions. Not enough, but significantly down. And actually now the developing countries as a whole are the dominant emitters, significantly more than 50% of global emissions in what we call developing countries if you include China. And if you look forward, global emissions growth is almost entirely dominated by what the developing world does. So there are these very different lenses on what's fair and who should do what, or who should pay for who to do what, and so forth. And I think it was almost the reaction to the US withdrawal could have gone either way, particularly with the US actively trying to dislodge, if you like, the international process. Having successfully done so at the International Maritime Organization, which I think was a terrible outcome, the only upside was I think a lot of the world suddenly woke up to just how dangerous this US administration is. And the reaction was, we can't let any state behave that way. I mean, to individually deny individual negotiators visas if they won't do what the US government, what a foreign government tells them to do, I think there was a real sense of outrage. And I think that probably helps to cement what may sound like very little, and Jo referred to, they reasserted multilateralism, and yeah, it's easy to do that. But every country there said, no, just because the world's biggest economy has walked away and behaving in this way, we're not going to. We're staying here. We're not only declaring multilateralism, we all reaffirm our commitment to the Paris Agreement, including its commitment for below 2 degrees. And so even Saudi Arabia and some of those, they resist specific actions, but over time their position will get more difficult if they're continually reaffirming their commitment to a global treaty in which it's obvious some of their activities risk undermining. So I think that's not a trivial factor. I think that, clearly the whole COP had its eventful moments as flagged. I was literally standing, I was for various reasons, I wasn't involved in the negotiations. I was there for a particular event which was occurring right towards the end. It was an event actually about some of our research on how to accelerate the global diffusion of low carbon technologies. And it was held on the Thursday afternoon of the final week. And Thursday lunchtime of the final week, I was standing there in the middle of the conference centre and, looking around, trying to catch up, looking at this very impressive pavilion hosted by the Brazilian government, the next to the Indian government, next to the Indonesian government, all beautifully laying out, selling what they're doing. I mean that in the positive sense. When I see a group of people rushing towards me. And my first reaction was, there must be somebody really important going to a meeting with the presidents of the COP and they're really desperate to get to the meeting. And then I looked a bit further, I thought, are those flames? And literally an entire pavilion had almost exploded with almost certainly an electrical fault. And some of you may have seen the coverage. My own video looked, I thought, pretty impressive when I sent it back home to say, I'm fine, but this was quite exciting. But my video was nothing compared with what then appeared from someone who'd been by it. This was not a minor fire where a couple of fire extinguishers. Literally, a whole pavilion went up in flames and it went straight through the roof of the pavilion. And we didn't know what that pavilion was made of. Some people thought it could have been made, almost of sort of, cardboard, and the whole thing would go up in flames. To be honest, I'm quite impressed with the Brazilian firefighters, security services, and some volunteered who, whilst most of the conference was running away, ran in the opposite direction, seized any fire extinguisher they could find, and they got it out within about 6 or 7 minutes, which I was really surprised at. It was also a reminder that in some circumstances, the biggest danger could have been a stampede, and 1 or 2 people did fall over as they kind of saw the flames and tried to run. So that was pretty dramatic. For the next few hours, we were all outside in the afternoon, watching the skies nervously as the weather turned to downpours. And obviously there was this big fear about what will this do also to the negotiations and the dynamics of it. It's difficult enough without having to evacuate pretty much the entire site. At 8 o'clock that evening, they announced that the delegates could go back in to collect some of their vital belongings, that negotiations would continue elsewhere through the night, and that the next day the conference centre would open for negotiations only and that there would be no side events there. Bit unfortunate for me, a trivial side thing. The main reason why I went there was a cancelled side event. The one upside was another event got moved to the green zone, which is outside of the negotiating arena, and you don't need an official badge, but is where all of civil society goes. And I was asked at very short notice if I could go to an event there and speak. And I have to say, the green zone's a lot more fun than the negotiation, unless you're like Joe and love watching these negotiators make their very carefully honed but important statements. The green zone was just a bustle of activity, of enthusiasm, of energy, of everything was happening there. And to my astonishment, this meeting put together about 2 hours notice, as far as I could tell, had about 60 people crowding round the edges wanting to hear what we were saying about actually partly how to accelerate low carbon developments and empower the rising generation. So it was a mixed bag. I think in a way I've realised it's one of these strange things where brands matter, and I'm conscious and I feel like an imposter that I've been to COP, therefore I know what it's all about. Jo knows more about this from watching the sessions on YouTube, I think.
Well, you could all
but
do that.
Being there,
anybody can watch it.
A lot of the negotiation process is remarkably transparent. Not, of course, everything. There's lots of secret huddles where they try and hammer things. But the underlying thing, you can watch what countries say and how they try and defend their positions. But of course, you do get a flavour from being there, talking to old colleagues in the margins, etc. So where does this leave us? First, let me take a major sidestep on a theme of technology versus politics. And almost you could say a focusing on the what aren't you allowed to do versus what should you be doing. And I think one of the interesting questions emerging is it proved almost impossible to get countries to agree even on phasing out fossil fuels. And there are various arguments they would wield, including, well, we could still use fossil fuels if you have carbon capture and storage, etc. Many of us are sceptical. But it was also fundamentally, people don't like being told what they're not allowed to do. Negotiations framed around that, I think, are going to be difficult. And I think many countries, developing countries in particular, feel, well, hang on a minute, we've got fossil fuel resources, we would like to sell them. And I think there's huge over-optimism actually about how much they may sell. The reason is, if you turn your lens around and say, what is it that positively we should be doing and what is going on that could help, it's really quite striking. I haven't got charts. I sometimes give lectures and I can put loads of charts about the extraordinary reduction in the cost of renewable energy. I mean, it is actually quite remarkable. The cost of even offshore wind energy has fallen by a factor of 3 or 4 in the last decade or more. The cost of solar, which when I started research was like considered the most expensive way of producing electricity you could think of, is now widely recognised as the cheapest electricity in history. And that's really important for developing countries, especially. Of course, it's a bit more complex. It depends on access to capital, technological capability, business capability, models, etc. But that has already started to materially change both emissions and chipping at the edges of mindsets. And it's not just renewable electricity by any means. A year ago, I was in Chongqing in China, and we still had all of the discussions here about electric vehicles, range anxiety, and they're really expensive to buy, and, I don't know the infrastructure. And in Chongqing, they said, we just don't understand this. Electric vehicles, they're cheaper to buy, they're cheaper to drive, they're cheaper to maintain. The new models run 300 or 400 kilometres easily. China has half of the world's charging infrastructure, 2/3 of the world's fast charging infrastructure. 60% of all vehicle sales last year were electric. And the reaction is, why does anyone think that future transport is going to be anything else? Why are countries still investing in internal combustion engines when that's clearly outdated technology? And that's kind of just where China's at now. And similarly in Australia, any country that doesn't have tariffs on Chinese vehicles will now recognise that electric vehicles are the cheapest way of getting around, as well as the cleanest. And for a country like India, just yesterday I had, this morning actually, conversation with visiting Indians, they're sick of the air pollution in Delhi. And they're embarrassed and they're worried about China dominating the supply chain of that technology. That also starts to chip away at the oil markets. And for a while I've been thinking, I can't believe the oil price will stay high forever if electric vehicles are doing this. And last week I saw a headline that the first consultancies predicted the oil price may undergo not just a modest decline, but a major crash. Now, that's a double-edged sword, but it means they won't have the same lobbying power in the future if that starts to happen. Slightly sort of perverse look at it. So what I wanted to do then was to wind back just a little bit to the international level, but from that more bottom-up, slightly technology-oriented perspective. And I think with just three things to say. At the international level, consensus is really difficult. You know, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Jo's written about this, never agreed rules of procedure formally in most areas. So the default is you have to have consensus, which on paper sounds like every country has to agree. It's not quite as black and white, but it does make it very difficult to make consensus with 190 countries, even if only, you know, half a dozen powerful ones want to block progress. One of the things we are going to see more of, and did see more, is coalitions. One I was intrigued by is that the Brazilian government convened a coalition, what it called an Open Global Coalition on Compliance Carbon Markets. That's quite a mouthful, but it's basically Brazil has legislated a cap on its emissions on industry with what's called an emissions trading system. Europe has already got a big one. China has had a big one in its electricity sector for several years and is just expanding it to cover energy-intensive industry. It basically sets a cap on emissions, allows companies to trade, and you get a price, but companies have to pay a certain amount for emissions. Those have always been fiercely domestic because there's a lot of money at stake, fiercely sovereign. Brazil, European Union, China to agree on a basic statement, and then the UK, Australia, Canada, Ethiopia, and a couple of other countries have all signed up, saying, right, we're going to collaborate on taking this further forward. They don't have to worry about Saudi Arabia or others. It's a coalition. You're not trying to get everybody to agree. They're saying, we're doing this, we can do it better if we collaborate with those who are also willing to. And then finally, just in terms of two particular countries, of which I've mentioned one and we're sitting in the other, China was very quiet in the negotiations. Very interesting. Some people for years would say, oh, well, China's getting better and it's going to do really lots of innovation, lots of green tech. It's going to really push. And it sort of has an economic interest that is now shifting towards accelerating decarbonisation. But it has a lot of complicated diplomatic issues about its relationship with other countries, its tendency, as Jo said, to sort of say, well, we're just doing what we think we should do, and it's not for us to engage in international diplomacy and in a leading way. That still really should be the job of the rich countries. But I don't think that's going to last forever. I just think China and many other major developing countries are totally recognize the reality of the science. They know that it could devastate their development as well as general global damage. They want to see this problem solved, and they're increasingly finding ways of solving it and making money out of solving it. And it's the countries like the United States, which are desperately trying to cling on to last century's energy system, that are ultimately going to lose out on this. I'm just convinced about that. I don't think that's wishful thinking. I mean, it will take a while for those balances. China was quiet for multiple reasons. I do not think it's going to be quiet forever. And when it moves, it's going to change a lot. It is also interesting that, you know, UK these days on the global stage is a slightly modest island in some ways. It's kind of nice to discover that what we've done on climate change has actually, on net balance, been pretty positive. We've had the most rapid decarbonisation of the power sector of any country on the planet. More than halving emissions in the power sector. Closed out. Britain used to be called an island of coal in a sea of oil and gas. Pretty strange place to be a world pioneer in decarbonisation, but it is. I mean, not in every area. There are certainly weaknesses, but there are positive tales to tell. And some of my time over the last year has been with China taking a real interest in Well, China, we're about 15, 16% of renewables. Britain is 35% of renewables. How did you do that? Because it's not simple. The policy and economic engineering of that is not simple. And they're really interested. And in the UK, so countries really are still looking at the UK as one of the few real leading countries. And in that sense, I think that we underestimate the power of example. If there's a government that is willing to stand up and has some diplomatic skill, they're not trying to tell the Chinese they've got to abandon their coal tomorrow because they couldn't, but there's a pathway with a lot of good lessons. And I think my closing remark is, I hope under the current government we can maintain that for the next few years. There is global interest. It is important there are examples of success. The UK is certainly not the only one by any means. There are more and more. You see, oh, actually, this problem is solvable and countries are starting to solve it. Not big enough at the global level, but definite, real progress.
Yes, from Jo's figures, it's clear that climate change, temperature, is going to go up. It's just a matter of how much. And I'm interested in the effect on food production. The government has a climate change adaptation committee chaired by Cambridge's Baroness Brown. And over the last 3 years, they raised concerns about food security in this country on 7 separate occasions. Was there any discussion of the effect of climate change on the global production of food?
Yes. Doesn't mean that countries are taking action about it. Certainly not at the global level. I think the level of scientific concern is a little bit varied because it depends a lot on what becomes unstable and would several bad things happen at the same time. I mean, the global, weather fluctuations are not new, of course. We all know that. We'll have crop failures. The global food system has developed to try and be resilient in theory. At what point climate stresses beyond the safeguards in that system are a bit unclear. What point the UK may be exposed is a bit unclear, but only a fool would go blindly forward and ignore those warnings. My impression from Climate Change Committee is they're worried that the government keeps studying this and acknowledging that there's a risk and not doing much about it.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I mean, agriculture is relatively new on the actual COP agenda. It's being discussed maybe for the past 5-6 years. So there is a work programme on agriculture because obviously, we're worried about it in the UK, but the impacts will be far greater in the developing countries, which already tend to have quite fragile environments, and they don't really have the capacity so much to adapt. But again, it's interesting to think about the politics because a lot of developing countries did not want to discuss agriculture because they would be worried they would be forced to adopt policies to reduce the emissions coming from agriculture because methane, nitrous oxide are quite important contributors. So that there's an element to which the actual politics of it can act as a brake on actual positive action, but certainly it is very much part of the conversation now.
Can I just pick up a theme which was partly developed by Prince William about the role of large organizations and how large organizations, in other words, the commercial business world, is not really playing their role, playing enough in order to help the move towards climate change. A, did you find that was a topic of conversation? And B, is there evidence that the larger organizations or the commercial world as a whole should really play a more stronger role, be this through maybe an educational process of their employees, so, that value system was starting to filter into an organization, let alone, from what you were saying, the fascination and study about transport and shipping, that is maybe an area that needs to be accentuated in terms of carbon footprints.
I mean, that there are big efforts underway at the intergovernmental level to engage businesses. That's very much there. It's called the Global Action Agenda. There are people called the high-level champions whose job is to engage with companies, and that does happen a lot. There's all kind of leaders clubs and all this kind of thing. I think in the run-up to Paris, there was a real momentum, and you felt that there was a critical mass of large and small organisations that were really getting involved, and they felt there were benefits to them. Partly benefits to their bottom lines because young people were interested and were more likely to buy products from a particular green company or whatever. And then immediately after Paris, there was this rush towards net zero. There was this real escalation of the number of companies that were declaring net zero targets. And it became a really fashionable thing to do. I think what's slightly disappointing is that hasn't necessarily stood the test of time. So there has been a dropping back on that, and especially now with Trump coming into power, there seems to have been, a shelving of, quiet shelving of climate policies, which is a shame. And especially in the US, there are certain coalitions of companies that used to exist, Net Zero Finance Alliance, which have had to disband because of the political influence there. I think the environmental NGOs would say that business, generally speaking, is a negative influence. And there's this big narrative about big bad fossil fuel lobbyists. I would say there's no reason why business as such should be a negative influence. I think there can be a very positive influence. I think there is an issue with oil companies. And I think all of us have been quite disappointed again that with the huge profits that oil companies are making at the moment, the windfall profits, they haven't been ploughed into renewable energy at all. They haven't. That there's, Michael wrote a paper about that, about the windfall profits, absolutely eye-popping. And if they were serious about what they said they'd do, which is to use their profits to move towards greener sources of energy, they would have done that, and they're not. So,
but sorry to interrupt. It's an interesting point you're saying that Generation Z, or the younger generation, is interested in the green issue
more. Yes.
But companies in the commercial world are still sort of living in a world of saying our shareholders are important,
exactly.
Money making is important.
Yes.
Oops, if that's against any green activity, well, we have to make a decision.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is a fascinating area. I'd echo what Jo said. Businesses are varied, they're complicated, they've got a lot of internal employees, many of whom are very well aware and concerned about these issues. And I think as I say, there was almost a narrative until a few years ago, certainly up and in the sort of the years after the Paris Agreement, before COVID and the energy crisis, that businesses were going to take the lead and now would forge ahead and solve this problem. And I think that including some of the oil companies. And I think two things have changed that in some places, but by no means all places. One, absolutely the energy crisis. And this is one area it's useful to explain things and understand them, and not apologising for it at all. But the oil companies, many of whom were laying out plans for net zero, the net zero strategy of Shell and of BP, etc., in the board meetings of those companies, the chief executives were trying to defend, why are you spending a lot of money on renewables when fossil fuels are making unbelievable profits? You're supposed to be making good care of our money, which we have put into your company's shares. And if you ain't doing your job, we're going to throw you out and we're going to put in a CEO who will go back to the roots of your company of fossil fuels. And that's what happened at BP. And a lot of people within those companies were not very happy ethically. The other thing, of course, is Trump. And it's important, this is not just the rhetoric of Trump, it is that Exxon in particular behind him, or obviously vastly the big US oil companies bankroll Trump's and they have pursued legal actions on the ground that a company that pursues environmental goals is operating against its legal requirements to maximize returns to shareholders. And companies, I mean, I don't know the language, but they've got scared. You could say they're cowards, but a lot of companies have retreated because they are afraid of being taken to court on the grounds that they're not pursuing the interest of their shareholders by doing environmental actions. And so there's the whole then debate around what should be the responsibility. Do you have such a thing as responsible capitalism? If a country government has got zero intention of putting a price on carbon, etc. But it's not universal. And one example I really would draw to your attention is when the Conservative Party conference, Femi Badenoch said she was going to move away from the Climate Change Act, the Confederation of British Industry came out with a blistering attack, saying business wants certainty. You cannot get certainty by tearing up legislation which was fundamentally rooted in science and agreed on a cross-partisan consensus. Business does not support the attempt to derail the UK's Climate Change Act. And I've heard that again and again from companies. They say, for God's sake, we know this is a real problem. Stop messing around with the furniture. You've got commitments in place. We might have grumbled at the time, but we're happy to try and just get on and deliver those commitments.
Splendid talk, I say. Anthony Cartman on the Creators Community Forum. The one thing that I'd be interested in your comments on the local impact on it, because I appreciate it's very, very global, and Cambridge is growing massively, and we're about to go out to consultation, or the City Council is, on the massive growth of Cambridge on Monday, with 8,000 pages worth of documents. Where do we start in terms of applying everything that you've mentioned here on something that is vastly complex and complicated? I don't know if any of you have actually seen some of the documents, so that we can give informed responses to the powers that be. And what is the role of yourself and the university generally in terms of engaging in that conversation? Because I haven't seen much coming from the university other than pro-growth on dealing with Cambridge's, for example, transport prices. Thank you.
Well, that's quite a big one. I think I might need refreshments before I...
Of course, two universities presented here. That's UCL and Cambridge.
I think Cambridge, actually, an answer to that one, I can give you an answer to that one. I think Cambridge is trying to get its act together on responding to consultations. I think Cambridge Zero, that there's a new person in charge there, and I've actually had an email today saying that they're going to be a lot more active. So I think you should hopefully get a different response that isn't quite so pro-growth from that particular quarter.
There's a lot that could usefully be said if you had a different panel here. The irony is, you know, both Jo and I slightly work at the slightly stratospheric level, the vast complications of global, and this issue is so big, I kind of think, yeah, local implementation is ultimately absolutely vital, and there's thousands of people in UCL who do work on buildings, cities, local distribute. I mean, there's masses of stuff going on, and the universities, of course, they're important. I think as universities, you know, do what they preach, and I think, to be fair, I mean, I shouldn't say it, but UCL is ranked top of the UK universities for its sustainability strategy and third in the world. So I'm kind of pretty happy to be doing this stuff. Even if I'm at the stratospheric end, UCL is doing a lot of stuff with Canon Council and lots of other things. And I think Cambridge absolutely has been trying to do more as well. Yeah, that's really, really important, because that's what most people can engage with. Unfortunately, it is also complicated, as you say. But what we do know is we have the technologies to solve this problem, and it requires us, you know, smart local action to deliver a lot of it. I think particularly around the buildings and transport sectors, huge amount can be done now.